Hi, everyone. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by Resolver, How to Stay Ahead of Emerging Risks. I'm Jamie Gahunia from Resolver. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. If you have any questions for any of the presenters during today's session, please submit them by writing in the question box. Feel free to ask at any point in the presentation, and we will reserve some time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. Following this session, the recording as well as the slides will be available on the OPISED. Today's session is a panel discussion with 3 leaders who will share their experiences and strategies on the topic of emerging risks. I want to introduce myself as the moderator for today's session. I'm Jamie Gahunia, Product Marketing Manager at Resolver. I have an internal audit and risk background and have been involved with a number of ERM implementations with Resolver clients. For those who don't know Resolver, we are a GRC software provider for ERM audit, vendor, IT risk, and incident management. To start off, I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves in the context of the topic at hand. We'll start with Sarah, and then Brian, and then Dan.
Hi there, Jamie, and hi everybody who's dialed in. My name is Dr. Sarah Gordon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Sotala. We're a risk management consultancy, and as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm based in the UK, so it is 6 o'clock in the evening where I'm at. With regards to emerging risk, we do lots of work with the mining sector, together with lots of other companies, governments, and charities based around the world as a whole. And so this is something that we've been working a lot with lots of different organizations very much in the recent months. Thank you.
Brian?
Great, thanks, Jamie. My name is Brian Link. I'm the CEO of Mobius One, and have been working in the realms of enterprise risk management, internal audit, internal control, emergency preparedness, and so forth for nearly 3 decades. And so currently working predominantly with folks in the cooperative sector and nonprofits and foundations, but also working outside, mostly focused now on COVID-19 response and looking forward to preparedness and getting beyond this. And so look forward to that discussion. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Stephen. I'm Manager of Operational Risk for Connect First Credit Union. We're a credit union based in Alberta, Canada. We have about 49 branches and have several billion in assets under administration. I've been involved in all assets of the business, from finance to technology to enterprise risks. So I'm bringing everything in my knowledge base to tackle this COVID situation, and then also helping in building our ERM program. So I'm looking forward to this discussion today, as well as everybody else. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. So let's get right into it. The risk of pandemic was a risk that many companies had on their risk register, but COVID-19 emerged so rapidly that many companies hadn't reviewed or tested their contingencies and business continuity plans recently. The most immediate impact it had on organizations was the changes and restrictions on social interactions. We quickly had to support a remote workforce, travel and events were canceled, foot traffic and on-site customers rapidly declined. And this impacted companies differently in very fundamental ways. We weren't completely unprepared for a business disruption of this magnitude, but it's probably safe to say that most companies did not have it top of mind. Right now, organizations are looking towards you, their risk leaders, to help them through this crisis. We've often heard that being a value add and getting buy-in for ERM teams has been challenging in the past. Well, not anymore. So in our agenda today, we will share how Resolver's risk clients have been immediately impacted by this pandemic and how they've responded. Dan will share how he has been dealing with COVID-19 and how he'll be managing risks post-COVID at Connect First Credit Union. Sarah will be presenting a practical emerging risk framework that helps organizations identify, prioritize, and analyze the impact of an emerging risk. And then Brian will share a risk assessment and remediation methodology that organizations can use to identify risks that may not have been on the radar and how to manage key remediation activities through to closure. Before we get started, I'd like to poll the audience. What has been the biggest COVID-19 impact to your organization? Mobilizing a workforce, remotely, supply chain destabilization, customer demand shock, financial liquidity, or other? And Dan, I'd like you to comment on those results and perhaps describe how COVID-19 has impacted Connect First and describe the day in the life of your COVID-19 response.
Well, the numbers I'm seeing here kind of reflect what we experienced at the Crane. One of our first tasks as we started planning, even before we had a reported case in Alberta, the executive and management got together and started to look at all of our pandemic plans and recognize that the remote workforce was probably our keyest target that we wanted to hit first. But technology was limited. We only had a few people with laptops, so we were able to secure some rental laptops, able to through fortunate timing, we went to a new VPN, increased our bandwidth, and within 2 weeks of planning, we probably had most of our administration staff on a remote location. The issue there was we had too much of our employees working in one location, and this allowed us to separate and get that social distancing. The other categories, the supply chain has been an issue with the Crayon. Most of our vendors are technology based, so they have the same issues with working remotely and have been able to meet their SLAs. The customer demand shock, that's going to be showing up eventually later. We came first to market to offer some relief to our membership, but we're anticipating that that's just masking what's going to be coming down the road. And so we're preparing for those. And of course, financial liquidity is always an uncertainty in this market. But we've managed to secure some good relationships with our members and brokers, and we don't anticipate an issue there. So pretty much exactly what the credit union has been experiencing is what I'm seeing on the screen right now.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. So from what we've heard from Resolver clients, here were their main impacts to them. I think, like Dan said, most would be familiar to you. Companies realized quickly that they had to digitize the workforce to avoid potential infections of their employees. Many were not ready to move their employees to a teleworking environment. There was disruption, there was confusion. Companies had to devolve their call centers to people's living rooms. Companies also experienced an increase in unauthorized activities and operational errors and mistakes. Depending on the industry, there were extreme effects on customer demand. On one end, travel and hospitality experienced dramatic drops, and on the other end, we saw panic buying of household essentials, leaving grocery stores with empty shelves. Some institutions had to check if they had enough cash to support potential increase in ATM traffic. Third-party providers experiencing their own issues created a knock-on effect. Questions like, how will we be able to source the way we did before? I think when the first outbreak started, China stopped manufacturing, which affected commitment of deliverables. Other companies relied on outsourced call centers, could not handle the volumes, which were up 300%. I think revenue generation has followed and will likely worsen over the next couple of months. And some companies may look at their lines of credits to see how much they could draw down to tie them over and maintain obligations to their employees and vendors. So this graphic highlights the economic impacts across the various sectors in the next few months. For commercial and aerospace, it might take years to recover from production and supply chain stoppages due to critical vendors located in areas impacted by the virus. For air and travel, the demand shock has been cited 5 to 6 times greater than September 11th, with near-term demand erosion due to international travel bans and quarantines. Oil and gas is experiencing a double whammy driven by both short-term demand and oversupply from OPEC's decision to increase production. Apparel and retail, the decline in private consumption, decline in demand for apparel taking longer to restart because the stores are closed. So on that note, I'd like to poll the audience again. How did your business continuity plans prepare your organization for the crisis? Completely prepared, significantly prepared, partially, or not prepared at all? Brian, I'd like for you to comment on the results once they're up. Brian, if you could comment on the results.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not seeing the results on screen.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Can you see them now?
Sorry, I cannot.
I'll let them know, we have significantly prepared at 45% and partially prepared at 47%. So between significantly and partially prepared was majority of the results.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not surprised by the result. Oh, there we go. Now it just popped on screen. So yeah, it looks like that comprises almost 90% of folks here. I think that a lot of folks may not have contemplated a pandemic, but certainly contemplated many related and sort of knock-on risks related to rapid onset of a recession or loss of key employees, supply chain disruptions, et cetera. So I think many aspects of those BCP, DRP plans are quite leverageable, and thank goodness that those were in place in areas that had been affected previously by SARS or other pandemics. Looking here in Ontario and BC, thank goodness that we had SARS, because there were actual pandemic plans in place, which were leverageable at this point in time as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We've heard from our Resolver clients that this is how they've responded. Most organizations have now deployed a plan to support employees that is consistent with conservative health and safety guidelines. A comment that we've heard the most is that the plans have to be flexible in order to accommodate policy changes as the outbreak unfolds. And companies have split staff across locations and on a rotating basis. Also, physical protection was initially important, but now people are shifting towards mental health issues. Customers remember how, from a customer perspective, customers remember how companies treat them at times of crisis. Grace periods and extended payment terms have been provided by companies. Customer demand may be down, but it has not disappeared. People have dramatically shifted towards online banking, shopping, and ordering for all types of goods, including food and produce delivery. On the liquidity front, companies are modeling their financials in different scenarios and identifying triggers that may affect revenue and cost. And for each trigger scenario, companies are defining moves to sustain the organization. On the supply front, most companies have already identified critical suppliers and now focused on immediate stabilization of their supply chain. And also, they're also thinking about managing the unusual spikes in demand when everything does come back online. Another risk your peers have also been managing is working with the regulators to understand and respond to their expectations. Also, reputation and strategic risks were also mentioned. I think by now everyone is suffering from a little bit of COVID impact fatigue. So let's shift now to how risks are going to be managed in a post-COVID world. Dan, I have a three-part question for you. What are your plans for managing risk in a post-COVID world? And do you see any increased attention from executives? And thirdly, are you planning on any enhancements or innovations to your processes?
So one thing that we learned during this process of COVID that when we quickly identify weaknesses or opportunities, we're having a discussion on a daily basis. Coming post COVID, that conversation will not happen, but we're looking at technology that will allow us to have everyone share that information as they experience it in their own departments, and then we share that information across all departments. Right now, we're on a paper-based process. Not right now, sorry, we just moved over to Resolver, but previously on a paper-based solution, and that made for very slow risk assessments. They were sort of timed on a quarterly basis. And we're looking at using technology to allow us to take that almost instantaneous analysis and risk assessments that we're doing right now and sort of translate that into something we can use in a product, something like Resolver. That opportunity to have a conversation, to start building those metrics that we need to tackle. Those are the main things that we're looking for right now.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. So what does it mean for ERM teams? So your organizations, including risk committees and board members, are looking towards you to help them navigate through this crisis, and as well as any other emerging risks beyond this pandemic. For now, you might want to redirect your expertise to COVID-19 priorities and enable real-time thinking, because once a year assessments is not going to be enough anymore, as Dan said. So going forward, you might need to identify new delivery models and non-traditional ways to help add value and mobilize your ERM program, including the use of data analytics and software tools. So for the remainder of the webinar, Sarah will go through some techniques to help teams identify, prioritize, and analyze emerging risks, and Brian will help us with some practical strategies to respond and monitor with those emerging risks. But first, we have another poll for the audience. What is your most useful technique when assessing the impact of an emerging risk? And Sarah, I'd like you to comment on the results when they do come up, and then I'll hand the presentation over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jamie. And just while I'm waiting for those results to come up, what I anticipate is to actually see quite a broad range of people using different tools. And perhaps you won't even have seen the main tool that you're using within your organization listed there as a whole. So there we can see, okay, there's no clear winner with regards to this as a whole. And that's because, of course, depending on what it is you actually do as an organization and the context in which you're operating, you may well need a slightly different tool or technique to help you with anticipating what the future might hold. And also your ability to actually take action and to manage it. Because of course, that is what risk management is all about. It's not just about identifying and assessing those risks. It's actually about doing something about those risks, be they potential opportunities or potential threats. So Jamie, if we can just move forwards onto the next slide, please. What you can all see in front of you here on the screen is a very high level definition for what is meant by emerging risk. As many of you will know, over the last little while, there has been a committee that has been put together to write a new ISO standard explicitly looking at emerging risk. And this is going to be called ISO 31050. And one of the working definitions for what emerging risk actually means is here in front of you. And it says a risk where the consequences may be substantive. Okay, so it's a really big risk, but for which the background knowledge of that risk is weak. So it's something where there's a huge amount of uncertainty and aspects that we just don't know very much about. And this weakness may be driven because the risk is developing or evolving very quickly, or perhaps because the context within which this risk sits is changing very rapidly, okay? So where you've got a lot of change or a lot of uncertainty, that's where emerging risks tend to come from. And Jamie, if we can move on to the next slide, please. This graph here is kindly being provided by Dr. Keith Smith, who is one of the members of that team of people that's putting together the new ISO 31050 standard. And what you can see here on this graph is an emerging risk always starts in a cloud of fog, i.e., so we can't see it, we don't know what it really is. And then generally with time, okay, and that time period could be very short or very fast because, of course, the velocity of that risk may change. You firstly begin to see that blue line emerge. And so that is the beginnings of the signals that something might be going on here. So if we go back to the beginning of 2020, this was, of course, when most of us started to hear about this new strain of coronavirus that had developed within the world as a whole, and we began to see those initial signals. Then what happens with regards to our understanding and our recognition and perhaps acknowledgement of that risk comes through that black line and that red line. So you're beginning to see more data points within the data set and a better understanding of what this risk really is. And it's only after we begin to see some of that and we get the acknowledgement that we begin to see the maturity of the risk management approach appearing, i.e. the management strategy or options that we have on the table that we can use to actually deal with this risk. And that's that green line that's beginning to appear. Sometime in the far distant future, we then get to regulation. And I think with regards to COVID-19, we're not really thinking about that yet. It will come at some point in time when we come out the far side of COVID-19, just like a whole load of regulation came once we'd got rid of the 2008 financial crisis. I suspect there will be a lot of regulation that will come into being with regards to the health side of things with regards to COVID. Where are we at the moment with regards to this journey, with regards to the emerging risk? We're somewhere over towards the left-hand side of this graph. You can see at the moment, many different countries around the world are still adopting different strategies with regards to their approach to managing COVID-19, as are many different organizations across the world as well. And this can then be translated and used to begin to help us envisage what might be the future risks that will be arising when we get through COVID-19 as a whole. Jamie, if we can go to the next slide, please. I'm sure many of you have been glued to graphs that look a little bit like this. This is one of my favorites. I think we will all have our own favorites. So our world in data, you can see that this is a print screen kindly stolen from our world in data 2 days ago. And as we know, all of those curves have matured over the last couple of days. And Jamie, if we can go to the next slide, please. This next slide just pulls out some of those curves from different countries around the world. And the reason that I pulled these out is because one of the reasons why, as risk managers, we're looking at these is because we know that the likes of China and South Korea are ahead of Europe and, say, North America with regards to the development of this virus. And Europe and North America are in turn ahead of the likes of Africa and Latin America. And this gives us actually quite a lot of insight in terms of how this risk may develop within our own nations, and also which management approaches, which controls might actually help us with regards to the virus as a whole. And of course, all of this can then be translated into our own businesses, our own organizations. Now, of course, with South Korea and China, this is a case here, as Brian mentioned earlier on, there have been some significant pandemics that have impacted on those jurisdictions in recent years. So therefore, people take it incredibly seriously. People are used to dealing with pandemics. And so therefore, if people are asked to stay inside, people generally do stay inside. But also, as well as with regards to China, the way in which the country operates means that you can keep people inside much more easily than might be the case in somewhere like Europe, for example, or Africa. If we then look at those blue curves there, so Italy, Spain, the UK, obviously things have matured a little bit over the last few days. And we can see that actually that isolation approach that the European countries have been taking really is working in terms of flattening that curve, and so therefore giving the space for the healthcare systems to actually be able to combat the virus as a whole. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. And I think what we will see in the coming days is formal announcements, for example, from the UK to say that our isolation that we're in at the moment will be extended for quite a significant amount of time. Where I'm sitting at the moment, I'm in the middle of London, only a matter, I'm probably within 700 metres of our Prime Minister, who's still in intensive care at the moment. Will that influence the approach that our country takes to COVID-19? Yes, of course it will, because you have senior leaders who are being directly impacted by it. In terms of the green lines, of course, we've got the USA and Canada there as well. And so, of course, we're seeing the virus doing what it's doing in those jurisdictions as well. And hopefully, obviously, we'll see some of those management actions kick into place and be effective in the coming days, if not weeks. Now, what is, of course, missing from this graph is, of course, Africa and Latin America. And the interesting thing here is we're seeing very different approaches being taken by those countries. Latin America has gone into, many countries have gone into significant lockdown, whereas in Africa, where we've seen countries go into lockdown, they've already lifted some of it because they just feel it's not possible to isolate people based on the conditions in which they live normally. So I think we will watch these graphs with trepidation, perhaps, over the coming months with regards to certain parts of the world. So this is all data, and this is all useful because it helps us try to anticipate what might be going on in the world round about us, and what does it mean for us in terms of our own risks to our own organisations, but also our management plans. So what do we think might actually work, us as organisations, not only survive this crisis, but also come out on the far side, taking advantage of all those potential opportunities that are on the table. And this is where we get to a nice little practical tool. And so if we can go to the next slide, please, Jamie. And this tool here is just a form of prioritization. So with regards to risk management, of course, we all love comparing impact and likelihood. But the problem with likelihood is it's really, really difficult to measure. And it's really quite subjective. It's also quite difficult because it can take a long time for us to move a discussion from the prioritization of risks to which of the risks are the ones that we actually need to do something about. And so what this graph here does is it just compares the potential impact of a certain risk against how much action do we want to take to try and manage that risk at this present moment in time. Now, when we're measuring our impact, obviously the impact of COVID-19 is not just on the health side of things. And of course, our hearts go out to everybody who is being impacted by this virus at this current moment in time. But we also know that there's a huge impact on our economy. We're now officially into a very, very significant recession across the world. And of course, there will be many other impacts as well. So within our own organizations, the manner in which we are dealing with this crisis will have significant impact on our own reputation. So are we actually living up to our own values as an organization? And also as well with regards to things like retention of staff, etc. So we can measure all of those different risks that we face on this impact scale. And of course, you can make this as granular as you like. Against the action side, this is something here where if there is nothing we can do about a risk, and often risks may well be totally outside of our control, despite the fact that they could have big impact on whatever it is we're trying to do. If there's nothing we can do, then we don't need to take any action. And so therefore they sit down at the bottom of the graph beneath that little dotted line. If, however, it is a risk where we feel we can do lots about it, that's where they sit up at the top of the axis. So where you can see risk number 2 up there. And so this is a really simple, tangible way through which you can begin to prioritize which of those risks are the ones that really mean something to your organization, that you want to do lots about, and they sit up in the top right-hand corner. If we move on to the next picture here, Jamie, this is just an example, and apologies for my terrible handwriting. Currently as an organization, we have a member of our team who is currently stuck in the Democratic Republic of Congo. What this shows you is that whilst we are concerned with regards to his health, and so with regards to COVID-19 as a whole, and you can see that right down in the middle of the graph, we're also concerned about things like a cholera outbreak at this point in time, because we know that the medical treatment that's available and the healthcare in the region is not great. We're actually more concerned about his security, because what tends to happen historically within this particular region is that when people get scared or when food gets scarce, that's when the security situation tends to fall apart. And so this is a case here of really looking at what is going on in this part of the world and what are the true risks to our particular team member. Our objective, of course, being able to get him home to his family as fast as possible, but more than that, keeping him safe and keeping him secure. So this is just an example here to say you can use this tool using Post-it notes and a piece of paper, or, and if we go to the next slide, please, Jamie, you can, of course, use Resolver. So here's my sales pitch for you, Jamie. Okay, so you can see here very simply within the Resolver tool, you just play with what's on these axes and you can use impact against action, and it immediately tells you which of those risks where lots of action is needed. And so therefore, very rapid prioritization for your team as a whole. Jamie, if we move on to the next slide, please. This is something here where the current situation, that is probably your base case, but you want to think about the future and different future scenarios. So what if Africa does actually manage to keep everybody in isolation? How does that actually impact on our guy on the ground? Or scenario 2, what if Africa's isolation or the DRC's isolation doesn't work, and so therefore that security situation escalates very rapidly? What do we do? And that's something there where when you paint that picture of what does that scenario look like, you can very quickly move those risks or those post-it notes around on that graph, thereby generating different future scenarios. You can then move on to the next slide, please, Jamie. You can then begin to think, well, what management option do we think will work best for those scenarios? Is it a case where we leave our guy there in the DRC, or do we pay various international organizations to airlift him out of there? Or do we go for a mixture of the two? Which management option is going to work best for as many of those scenarios as possible? And this is something here where, again, if you keep this super simple, keep the data and the numbers away from this when you're doing your initial scenario analysis, but also your management option analysis against those different scenarios, you can get through this exercise in a matter of 30 minutes. And so therefore keep up to date with regards to the context that is developing across the world. So impact against action using something like Resolver or just post-it notes on a piece of paper helps you to keep abreast of what is going on in an evolving situation as a whole. And so with that, it's a case here where if we can just go to the next slide, please, Jamie. As you can see here, this is a case here where with regards to our guy who is still in the Congo at the moment, you can see those blue post-it notes are where we've applied actions or controls or treatments to those risks. And you can see that they've gently moved down below that dashed line on the piece of paper. Are we happy yet with regards to the security breakdown in this jurisdiction? No. But have we reduced that risk in terms of how scary it is for us as a whole? Yes. Is there more we still need to do? Yes, but that will happen in the coming days. So you can see this is a very dynamic way of doing scenario analysis, but more than that, deciding what actions you need to take in order to be able to manage those risks ahead of time and ahead of those emerging risks. Thanks, Jamie.
Excellent. Thanks for that insightful analysis, Sarah. Just a reminder that these slides will be available after the session. So before we go to Brian, we have our final poll, which is, in the next 6 to 12 months, what will be your priority for your risk team? And Brian, once the results come up, if you could comment on those results, and I'll hand the presentation over to you.
Great. And I'll let you know if I don't see them.
Okay, I think we can end the poll.
Okay, Great, I can see it. And it looks like we probably needed an all of the above button because everything matters. This is a time where, there are an awful lot of balls in the air for risk management folks. And so, but perfect segue though, setting up the framework for future emerging risks. So thank you to everybody that voted for that, because that's a wonderful segue into the next segment.
Excellent.
All right, fantastic.
Okay, there you go.
So where are we today? I think that as everyone knows, there was planning and preparation done historically before the pandemic hit. There have been pandemics in the past, quite regionalized. But certainly people were thinking about the knock-on effects of the pandemic, the sudden recession, geographically focused disasters, major data breaches, et cetera, on this left-hand side, planning and preparation. And this sort of sequence here, planning, preparation, response, and recovery, is a common framework applied across the globe around emergency preparedness. So, folks like the UN, Red Cross, emergency departments across the world, all use a very close variant of this framework. Where we are today in terms of assess and respond, folks are looking at impact, certainly, and as Sarah mentioned, likelihood. So many things are happening simultaneously. Two things: likelihood isn't really that relevant because it's happening now, and secondly, as mentioned, there's a lot of bias, a lot of subjectivity. And so rather than impact, and Ryan, who sent in a question here earlier with regard to what axes are helpful, instead of having likelihood, perhaps suggesting that we replace that with management preparedness or control effectiveness. And that gives you a sense of what should we do about it? Because the whole idea behind doing risk assessment is to help drive appropriate, prioritized responsive action. And so this kind of a view helps you inform that. If something's really, really well controlled but high impact, maybe you want to validate those controls through independent assurance. Conversely, if it's not well controlled but the impact is high, that should be the focus of remediation. So that's where we are today. And now we're looking at, where do we go from here? And so as we go into recovery and restart and reimagining, we're looking at risk, certainly, because we're in a very dynamic risk environment, but we're also looking at opportunity. And I hate to put it this way, but we're going to get to a point very soon where the only way to go is up. And so we need to be, and growth will be assured. So we need to be ready for that. So we also need to be taking a look at opportunity and looking at the actions needed to both manage risk and to address those opportunities. Okay, next slide, please, Jamie. All right, so for those folks that have asked, are we going to get the slides? Yes, and you'll need to because the print on these are so small. But this is an attempt to look at all the dimensions of a COVID-19 response program. What are the objectives on the left-hand side? What are the risks associated with those objectives, and what are the risks that we're facing as an organization? And what are the indicators that we are succeeding or not from a risk perspective? And also, what are the performance indicators of whether or not we are succeeding in our initiatives? And then, obviously, there's been a lot of focus on controls, updating travel policies, implementing social distancing, et cetera. And we have achieved somewhat of a new normal in that range. A lot of those policies have been updated and so forth. So the question is, where do we go from here? And so at the macro level, at the governmental level, the key is we don't know the answer to that question unless we have good data. If we know how many people have been infected, if we know if we've hit the sort of the herd rate of immunity, et cetera, we don't know when we can start to take the lid off. We don't know when critical employees can come back into the operation. And so it's imperative that risk assessment be dynamic and continuous and help to inform what is that appropriate responsive action. And so on the right-hand side, it speaks to the importance of reporting. Dynamic risk assessment, really getting a profile of where are we today or where are we this week in terms of cadence. So weekly on the risk reviews. But the responsive activities, we really need to have a finger on the pulse in terms of control remediation, control compliance, and the indicators of success or indicators of where threats might be trending negatively or positively. All right, the next slide, please, Jamie. This is from Boston Consulting Group's Henderson Institute, very, very high level, but it really just speaks to the point that our world will permanently change as we come out of this. And the thing is, there are going to be opportunities and risks coming out of those macro level global changes, attitudinal shifts, shifts in terms of buying patterns. Certain industries will be affected more than others. But what is known is that there will be durable, lasting effects. So the sooner that organizations can get a sense of how those will impact the operations from a risk perspective, but again, from an opportunity perspective as well. And that's where we really want to focus here going forward. So on the next slide, Jamie, on the next slide, here we go. Again, don't worry, we'll send you the slides afterward. Lots of small print here, but everyone's focused right now at the number one column, recovery and restart, getting back to the line. And it starts at the top with strategy and business planning, really looking at what are our options, looking at various scenarios, real key focus on cash flow, obviously, but also instead of looking at revenue, I think everyone said, okay, let's tear up the revenue forecast, but we do need to focus on earnings and cash flow, the lifeblood of the organization, because that will allow us to do the right things when it comes to HR, our customers, et cetera. What I'm seeing and encouraging is that there's no more important time to certainly do all the right things from an employee perspective, and I think we're seeing a lot there, but to start thinking forward about customers, not only retaining and growing your most important customers today, but thinking about how do we move forward with them. So staying in close touch, getting executives directly connected with key customers, and taking that feedback loop and using that to drive and identify those growth opportunities. But each silo here, customer, sales and marketing, supply chain, legal, no matter your industry sector, everyone needs to play their role and start thinking about each of these phases of restart, getting back to the line, rebound, getting above the line, and then ultimately staying there. So what are the things that each person, each functional area are going to have to do? And again, it starts from the top, going down to the bottom. All of us in the risk management realm and or assurance realm need to think about, how is my role changing? How do I need to support the board and management in ensuring that we make it through? And don't forget, because when the dust settles, we want to be able to capture the tacit knowledge that we've developed. And so that'll be critically important as well. Capturing the lessons learned and then saying, you know what? Thank goodness we've gotten past this largely. Now let's take another look at risk. And the boards, I think, will be demanding this to say we want to get caught flat-footed again. So let's take risk assessment really seriously now and use that to help ensure that our strategy and associated risks have been identified, but also the more global environmental risks are more thoroughly considered as we go forward. So hopefully things like climate change, et cetera, will start to get a bit more context in the conversation and a bit more focus, because they are and will be impacting us at the macro level. All right, the next slide, please. On the softer side of things, your organization and you will be remembered in terms of how you respond to COVID-19. So the cause and commitment, the why of the organization is absolutely critical, because it will then be the anchor by which people decide what can and should we do with regard to our community, our employees. How does it impact our culture? The character of the organization, as it were, will be defined by the actions taken in the months and year or 2 years ahead. Of course, in order to do all those wonderful things, we need to have the capacity and currency, the cash, to do it. And so, focusing on cash flow, yes, is absolutely critical today. Can't overemphasize that enough, but there needs to be a pool of investment that's retained to take advantage of those opportunities to differentiate and to grow as we come out of this. And again, we have nothing to do but grow in over the months ahead, because the only way to go will be up. So with that, the next slide, please. Okay, and where are we today? We're looking again at the recovery, the restart, and then reimagining, reinventing. That's the key opportunity. And it's important to encourage people now to say, get the job done, triage what you have to, but start thinking about what we need to do to get things back running again. If on the employee side, I think there was a question with regard to employees and how do you start to stage people back? It's starting to think about how do we come back in work pods. A lot of organizations are doing that, to think about if there is a reinfection, you can contain that pod. How do we prioritize critical workers? The CDC just issued guidelines early today around bringing essential workers back and what can be done to stage that reintroduction of employees into the facility. But again, no better time to think about recovery and restart and reimagining, because as you mentioned, Jamie, at the outset, those companies that were resilient, as they call them, through the last Great Recession, those that took advantage of this time, not only grew, but maintained that level of higher growth into the future. So it's the best of times and worst of times, as one once said. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So to build on what Brian said, I wanted to emphasize a few statistics about resilience. So resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. Companies reveal themselves in a crisis. It's an opportunity to separate non-resilient companies from resilient. The resilient companies that survived the 2008 financial crisis increased revenues by 30%, reduced operating costs by 3 times, and moved faster and harder on productivity. So circling back on today's topic on staying ahead of emerging risks, I do wanted to recap on actionable items for ERM Teams. Organizational resilience requires an early identification and analysis of issues and a rapid response to adjust to any emerging risks. Much like Sarah and Brian have mentioned, I hope you have taken away some practical strategies to use and manage emerging risks going forward. And as Brian said, we have to embrace the opportunity, prepare to bounce back, and come out stronger. So that concludes our webinar. We do have some time for Q&A. There are lots of questions at the Q&A, so I am going to ask the presenters some right now. So this question is for Dan, actually. Have you thought about how to recommend bringing people back into the office after working from home? What your plans are for sort of bringing everyone back to the office?
Currently, we're using the Alberta healthcare system to indicate when is the best time to do that. We've taken the extraordinary approach of closing all of our branches and just having appointments available for appointments. So in our branches, we have everybody working as per normal. Of course, we do have our absenteeism that is a little bit higher at this time. But in terms of the administration office, basically once we hear the okay from the government, basically we'll be shifting those remote workers back into the office. Of course, the new normal is we've found that working from home can be just as good as working in the office, but so we may not have 100% return, but I think the intention is to bring everybody back.
Excellent. And question for you, Sarah. Can you address what changes that organizations would be making or what to consider to ensure ongoing COVID-19 risks or opportunities are addressed in the organization's risk register?
Yes, so I think this is something here where most of us had pandemic in our risk register, but it was maybe pandemic. None of us imagined what would be going on right now. So this is a case where I think, all of us will be updating those risk registers with regards to what is actually meant by pandemic. We may also actually break out pandemic into a number of different risks. And actually, this is something here where we may use different scenarios rather than single unwanted events, because the thing about COVID-19 is it's not just the virus, it's everything else that's coming with the virus and how it applies to your particular context. So I think there are a number of things here. Is number one, seeing your risks in a network rather than individual siloed events. So seeing it as a network, because that gives you a much better context for what you're talking about. And secondly, being more dynamic with your risk assessments as a whole, exactly as both Dan and Brian have mentioned. So this isn't something that we do every 6 months. This is something that changes every day. And almost our game that we're playing as risk managers is how often can we actually update the organization?
Excellent. Yeah. Actually, on that note, we have a follow-on question for Sarah. Is it advisable to raise the risk appetite for companies overall during the pandemic crisis?
Yeah, I think this is something with regards to risk appetite and tolerance. I suspect that most of us realize that we have breached all of those levels that we'd maybe set purely so that we can survive what is going on right now. So from an academic perspective, this has been great because it's actually been testing what can our businesses and our organizations truly endure. I think this is something where with regards to things like the commercial side of the organization, the operations side, etc., yes, I think that your appetite can be changing depending on what kind of sector you're in. The thing where, and this points to something that Brian said during his part of the presentation, is our reputations and our values are being tested at the moment. So in terms of where we are breaching our own rules, perhaps on a commercial side, the organizations that will come out the best are where they've stuck to their values and their virtues as a whole, rather than breaching all of those kind of aspects in terms of risk appetite. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense, Sarah. A question for you, Brian. What do you see the future of risk management professionals after this crisis? Will people take risk teams seriously?
Oh, you bet. This is a great time to be a risk manager. Absolutely. Right now we're in the heat of it. We're in the eye of the storm. I think a lot of things will be happening. I think board members will start to demand better insights around risk. And so it is part of their fiduciary responsibility for risk management oversight. And I think from a regulatory perspective, you're going to start to see the regulators start to, if they haven't already, insist that there be a robust risk management approach in place, especially within financial services. So if you're a bank or a credit union, what have you, where the regulators already looking at financial and operational risk and capital allocation and so forth, they're going to want to see a little bit more robust evidence, and hopefully that's also going to provide a catalyst for some folks to get extra funding, be it for technology or people or what have you, to get that job done, because there's a lot to do. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully we'll get away from spreadsheets with that renewed interest and hopefully motivation and accordingly budgets.
Yeah, so we have a follow-on question on budget. What strategies can we use to convince the board to invest in technology to assist in times like this? A lot of processes at our credit union are manual.
Yeah, that's quite typical. Spreadsheets prevail, but spreadsheets are an awfully ineffective way of gathering data and reporting data. So, if the board has an expectation of seeing reports in a timely fashion, as they should now, and the regulators again as well, especially there in a credit union environment, it's going to be very, very important to say, well, yes, this is an important job. It needs to get done. Technology to do this more efficiently, both in terms of data gathering and reporting in real time, it will be all that much more critical. So hopefully they won't need much more than that. And if that's not enough, perhaps the regulator will give them a little nudge as well.
Excellent. A question for Sarah. The world has been stress tested did we pass?
I think we would be fairly bullish to answer that question right now. I certainly hope that we're passing. I think we've got a long way to go with COVID-19. It is not over yet. And certainly the economic downturn that we are progressing into at the moment is going to be significant. I think with regards to that as well is we're not going back to what the world looked like in December. The new version of the world is going to look very, very different. And so therefore the exciting thing about all of this is what is the new normal going to look like? And can we adapt our own organizations and be nimble enough to actually take advantage of this new normal space? So with regards to the stress testing, I hope we survive. I'd like to survive. I don't think we're there yet. And I think that there's some very, very big decisions for some of our world leaders to be making in the coming months to ensure that we do survive. And they haven't necessarily made those decisions yet. Thank you.
Excellent. So there are a lot more questions that we'll have to take offline. I wanted to thank all our panelists for their time. A reminder that the webinar and all slides will be available in a few days. So thank you, Dan, Sarah, and Brian for your time and expertise. So as we sit behind the safety of our laptops, I just wanted to send a quick message to those who have families and friends on the front line. From Resolver and all our panelists, we thank them and we appreciate them. And thank you everyone for joining. Have a safe weekend.